Hey guys, welcome back. So in today's tutorial, I wanted to talk about prepping our models, sculptures for texturing and for game engine. So this model here, or these two sculptures, main sculptures anyways, it's about 25 million. So that's way too many polygons for texturing. It will be nearly impossible to unwrap this. And Substance Painter probably wouldn't even take it at all, let alone a game engine. So what we need to do is create a low poly version and then bake some details across. So there's multiple ways we can do this, and that all depends on the polygon budget you have for your game. Um, and there's many different approaches, and all valid, just as long as you get a good result in the end. So for this example, I'm just going to focus on this top part of the shoulder armor. This bottom part is not completed. So this decorative piece here is not done. All the metal sort of surrounding areas. So I'm just going to focus on this part here. All right, so let's get this sort of prepped. What I'm going to do is just go to my subtool palette, and I'm just going to hide a bunch of things that we're not going to be working with. So this and these pieces can just disappear. And this part here, which is this fur bit, can go as well. Right, so we're just left with these bits. You know, while we're at it, we may as well hide the character and this sort of band thing that's holding it together. So the one thing I like to do when I'm prepping the model is I like to make sure that it's airtight, meaning that there's no sort of gaps that air or water can sort of go through. So for example, if you notice here, we have this issue, right, where there's a little tiny hole between these two pieces. This can cause issues, especially if you're going to go for a one sort of mesh to wrap around the whole model itself. It can definitely cause some issues when you're going through a Dynamesh process to get a singular mesh, right? So what we can do here, and one of the issues that we need to watch out for is that you end up with this sort of business where you have pieces of mesh kind of floating inside, and that's not something that we want. Now, for this example, it might not be such a problem because of the way I'm going to be doing it. But we definitely don't want our low poly mesh to have any of this stuff happening, and that can happen when you have when you're just not careful with your mesh and it's not airtight. So, and that can happen when you don't have an airtight mesh and you Dynamesh. You can create a sort of mesh inside. So with this, all I'm going to do is just make sure I have symmetry turned on. All right. Just going to zoom out a little bit. All right, press X, and I'm just going to grab this piece, just move it in, just like that. These pieces here might cause a little bit of issue. There's a bit of a gap there. You can sort of squeeze that a little bit tighter if you need to. I think it'll be fine. Again, we're not going to go for a singular mesh to wrap around this whole thing, at least for this example. So it's not that much of an issue, but it's still something that I like to do anyways. Just I find that it's good practice just to go through and check your mesh. Make sure everything's all good. Make sure everything's all airtight or watertight, whatever you want to call it. There's no tiny little gaps everywhere. Right. Whoops. So I want to take a look at this and see if there's any areas that could be troublesome. So this part here might be a bit of an issue where it sort of goes in. So I might just bring that up a bit more. Tuck that in a little bit. Right, I think that looks better anyways. Right. just check the edges here. You can see that we've got a tiny little hole right here. So I'm just going to pull that in just to check the rest of this mesh. Great. Okay, so these parts here would definitely cause some issues. This lift up of this metal sort of plating. But I plan on having these guys as separate pieces. So it's not going to be a problem. And over here looks pretty good as well. Okay, so now that we have that completed, there's a few things that we can do to get ready to prep this. First is to think about all the pieces that we want. So I think for this piece, just to keep the process smooth, because we're not going to be manually retopoing this, we're going to be using a sort of hybrid method of manual and auto. I'm just going to try to keep as much separate pieces as possible and just combine them together. It's not necessarily wrong. There's definitely things that would be not as optimized as it could be, because we have sort of intersecting meshes and meshes that aren't really doing anything and so on. But we can do a little bit of mitigating later down the track when we unwrap certain pieces. For example, the unwrap for the underside of this piece can be significantly smaller because it's really not going to be shown than the outer side. Right. Those are the sort of things that we can sort of work with. But in any case, I'm going to use multiple pieces for this project. So I'm going to start off with this piece here. And I've already gone ahead and I've done some of this. So what we want to do is copy this piece. And it's probably a good idea to rename these pieces, because you do have quite a lot of these individual subtools and it can get a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to highlight the subtool and just rename this. And I don't really know what this piece is called, but I'm just going to rename this as high poly. And this here is the low poly version. So I'm just going to solo these two pieces out. What I can do is just hold down Shift and select this subtool. And then I can just enable the eyeball on these two subtools here. So we can see what these are. Right, so that is the low poly version, and I'll walk through how I got to this point. And then we'll go from there. So I'm just going to delete this original one, or this one that I did earlier, and start that again. So we have this piece here. What I want to do is just duplicate this. Right. So I'm going to rename this to low poly, so LP. And what we're going to do is we're going to start defining some of these curves or some of these hard corners. So we're going to use a Z-remesh method, which is this function here in the geometry tab. And we're going to use the keep groups function. What we want to do is panelize this sort of mesh here using our polygroups. And when you polygroup, or when you Z-remesh with polygroups turned on or keeps groups turned on, it can somewhat dictate the surface or the topology of the mesh through that auto retopology. So you can get a fairly clean result just by doing that. And that's what we're going to do. Slightly different method to just holding down Shift and masking an area and pressing Control W. What we want to do is use the polypaint method and a plugin called polygroup it. So that comes with ZBrush, so that's great. So what we want to do is we want to paint almost like the hard surface edges, right? And we want to use polypaint for that. So to do that, we can go into the the tool palette, scroll towards the bottom, and then we want to highlight, open up the polypaint sub palette. We want to press colorize. You can see that I've done this already, right? So what I'm going to do is just show you the results of this, or I'm going to show you what this looks like. And this is basically what we're aiming for. So I'm looking at sort of the edges of the mesh itself, and I want to create a black line there. And that's we're kind of painting out the polygroups, right? And we're going to use the plugin to grab those pieces for us, right? And how this works is that we need to paint these black lines everywhere. So what I'm going to do is just go to a white color and just press fill color. This is kind of going to reset everything, right? And I'm going to use my clay builder brush and pick a black color in the color swatch. And up in the top toolbar, I'm going to change it from Z add. So I'm going to take that off. So we no longer have Z add or sub, and use RGB. Right. Now this will allow us to paint this black paint everywhere. Right. We want to make sure that we're working at a fairly high poly count. So if it's fairly pixelated, so the edges, if they're fairly pixelated, just press Control D, and that will subdivide, and that should give you a sharper edge. Right. With this, I'm going to adjust the depth of this pen and just bring that down, and I think that should be fine. So the embed, I'm just going to bring that down to 0, or bring that up. Yeah, up is better, and that will give me a nice clear paint even on these cornered pieces. Great. So not using such a large brush, I'll probably use something a little bit smaller than this. That should be fine. And I'm going to increase the intensity all the way to 100. And then to help with this, what I'm going to do is use my lazy mouse. So over here in the stroke palette, in the menu bar, I'm going to activate lazy mouse and increase the lazy radius. Right, this will allow me to draw straighter sort of lines. Right. Right. And I'm just going to go across like that. Doesn't need to be perfect, but you got to make sure that the edges are sort of, closed off, basically. So we don't want to add a line like this, right? Because that's going to do nothing. We want to make sure it's closed off, right, for that polygroup plugin to work. So I'm going to get this line here, bring that across, and I'm just going to draw a straight line down here. And to help with this shape, I'm going to draw a line down here. Of course, yours will be different to mine. And over here, just going to grab that shape and try to follow this hard edge here. I'm going to just skip over these sort of slashes that I've made and just use the baking process inside Substance Painter to bring back that detail. Okay, and down here, might redo this line. Great. Just continue this line all the way up. Okay. I think I want to sort of dictate this extra sort of flat edge here. So I might come into here and just grab this part of the mesh. Oops. You just want to make sure that there's a clear separation between these lines and the other lines. Otherwise, the plugin can get a little bit confused as to what it's trying to do, what you're trying to ask it to do. All right. And over here, I'm just going to have a line in the middle. So I'm going to grab a flat area like this, and we can put the pen down on the Wacom tablet, hold down Shift, and we can drag a straight line. Whoops. Hold down Shift, let go of Shift, and it'll drag a straight line. And I'll do the same up here. Great. Oops. So if it's come through, so this area is pretty thin. It looks like it's coming through. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this back to the add. And I'm going to have backface masking turned on. And I'm just going to fill this area out a bit because it looks like it's going to be a bit too thin. Oops, that's too much. Bring that intensity right down. Just give that a little bit of extra thickness there. Smooth that out. And then we'll redo that line anyway, so it doesn't matter. Right. So you don't really see this part, so it's okay if it's not perfect. But I definitely don't want that to be smoothed out. So I'm just going to Control Z a few times and get back to sharper details here. Right. So remember, each brush has its own backface masking. So if I hold down Shift, all of these settings here in the brush palette is for the current brush you have selected. So make sure you have backface masking turned on for your smoothing. Okay. Great, that looks good. So I'm going to go back to RGB and let's get that black paint back in here. Like this. Okay, that looks good. Oops. Might make that a little bit thicker. Just trying to get the right angle. And that would do. Okay. Great. And over here, just to fix this little guy up, I'm just going to change the color to white, and I'm going to paint that out. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. I thought about circling these areas here, like this, but closer to that bolt there. But I noticed that these aren't fused on, so they're separate. So they're going to be treated separately anyways through the Z-remesher. So I'm just going to leave it as that. But if they were part of the mesh, like they're Dynamesh together, you probably want to come into here and circle this area like that. And that will just help guide the Z-remesher to form a circle at this point. So let's test out the plugin. So let's go to plugin in the menu bar. And let's go down to polygroup it. Now I'm just going to dock this Z plugins to the right there. And we want to use this bottom one here. I'm going to press that. If you have any subdivision levels, it might not like that, so you might have to delete it. Okay, so I'm going to press Shift F. And this is what we want. So I'm going to turn the lines off in my polyframes, so we can sort of see it a little bit better. That looks pretty good to me. So I can turn off polypaint, because we don't need that no more. Bring that back to white. And then now, with my polyframes on, I'm just going to Z-remesh this. So remember, this is on our low poly one and not our high poly. So I'm going to Z-remesh this at half, and I'm just going to make any adjustments that I need to make as I go. So go to your geometry, subpalette, ZRemesher. I'm going to go half at a time, and it's very important to keep groups, right? So when we ZRemesh, we're going to ZRemesh per group and then connect it essentially. So what happens is that we retain this nice edge on the surface, right? If not, if you don't do that, then you can, all the edges soften out quite easily. So let's ZRemesh this and let's check out the results. So your first time doing this, it can take a bit of time. So you just want to take a look at some areas. So let's take a look up here. That hopefully should fix itself as we sort of continue to ZRemesh. So we'll keep an eye on that, as well as these areas here. We got this extra poly group here, which is not ideal, but that's okay. We'll keep that. And this line here is getting a little bit wonky, right? So to fix that, we can use a special type of smoothing. So if we press the comma key on the keyboard to bring up our lightbox, just let this autosave happen. We can go to the brush tab, and if we scroll over to smooth, open this up, we can smooth by groups. So smooth groups, that's the one that we want. It's just going to tell us that we're going to assign this smooth to the shift key. Now, if we hold down shift, you can see that we have smooth groups turned on. And I'm going to increase make sure the intensity is all the way up. I'm going to turn RGB off if that's on. And I'm just going to smooth this area out. And you can see that we can sort of control this line here. Now I'm going to turn the lines off because it's kind of distracting me. And I want to fix this line up. It's not going to be perfect, but we can sort of reduce the wobbliness like over here. We can come into here and fix that up. And what ZBrush would do is it will look at that line as straighter. And the next time we ZRemesh at half, ideally that line will be straighter, right? Which is what we want. So we want to gradually do this and not all at once. So we don't want to just go target poly count really low. We want to go half, and every time we go half, we want to adjust the edges, make some fine adjustments or fix up any sort of errors, and then ZRemesh again, right? So I do have symmetry turned on, but just something to note, what I've noticed as I've done this many times before, the symmetry in this brush here doesn't always work as nicely as the other ones. So you might find that even though symmetry is on, it's not working as good as it should. All right, so just keep an eye on that. For the most part, it does work, but sometimes it just doesn't. Okay, that looks pretty good. Might do one last pass over here and up here and over here. Okay, so let's ZRemesh this. I'm going to turn the lines back on. Great, that looks good. No obvious sort of errors so far. Still keeping an eye on this area and these slashes. So let's continue ZRemeshing at half. Great, so we've got some errors here, and you guys might encounter this as well. It's an easy fix. All we need to do is just go down to Mesh Integrity and just press Fix Mesh. 9 times out of 10, that will work. There we go. Okay, so this one's not too flashy. So let's try that again. We don't want this sort of crazy topology here. We want to make sure it's nice and clean like this. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to inspect the edges again, and I might come into here and smooth some areas out that need a little bit of smoothing. Maybe up here. Right. And don't know what's going on here, but I'm just going to smooth that out. And we did not see that. And I'm just going to pay attention to this little part up here as we sort of go. So I might smooth this out a little bit, give it a bit of room just to remesh. And then I'm going to run the Z remesher again. At half, keep groups. Great, so that's looking good. We've kind of lost a little bit of geometry here. So what I'm going to do is just Control Z. I want to go back a little bit, and then maybe let's turn adaptive on. Let's smooth groups this area just a little bit, give it a little bit more room to spread out that topology. And up here as well, where we had that issue before. And I'm just going to try that again. So adapt would sort of give you a little bit of extra polygons in certain areas where you need it. In this case, this sucks. Like, this doesn't look good at all. So I'm going to Control Z and then try that again. Except what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn half off. And then at this point, we can maybe press the same with adapt on and just try different combinations of this Z remesher. Great, that's better. So sort of spreaded things out a little bit. All right, so it looks good. I'm gonna try half again. All right, that's looking good so far. Great, that looks good. And let's try that again. I might be pushing it, but let's try it again. Oh, that's even better. All right. Smooth this area out a little bit. And maybe here, get those straight lines in. And then I'm going to keep going. So you just want to keep going until it starts to break too much and then just fix it. But if the polygon density on yours is around about here, then for this example and for what we're going to be doing, this should be fine. In the real world, you probably want to go as low as possible, but we're trying to focus on going through the process. So let's just Z remesh this at half. That looks good. That looks even better. I'm really happy with that. And I think pushing my luck here, I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I might just leave it at that. Great. So now that we have this low poly version, I'm just going to turn my poly frames off. So we have this mesh. And then I want to go back up to my subtool and turn on the high poly model. So the idea here is that we want to make sure that the low poly, which is this one in the poly frames, is somewhat hugging this high poly model. There are ways that we can make this work. The simple way is just to turn on this button here, which is transparency. And we can sort of see how this isn't quite matching up. And little things like this is easy enough just to use the move brush, making sure we have RGB turned off and just simply moving this shape up. Right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but the closer you can sort of get it, the better, I think. Because it looks more like the original design that we've made. And also the baking process will be a lot easier a lot more predictable if this low poly mesh hugs the high poly mesh as close as possible. So I like to do this afterwards manually where I can move and pull things around until they fit as best as I can, right? And then what we can do is I might grab these guys, just make them a little bit bigger like that. And I'll do the same for these guys. Okay. Then what we can do is we can project some details across. So just to get that nice tight fit, you can turn this back off. And then over here in our subtool palette, we can go to project. And I like to have the low poly on top of the high poly in the subtool stack, although I don't think that matters, right? And what I'm going to do is have everything that I don't want projected off, except the parts that I want on. So it'll be the low poly and the high poly. And then I'm just going to turn off color because we don't want to project the color. And I'm going to say project all. Great. So let's solo this out. Let's take a look at it. So this method can generate some very interesting results, especially if you have a mesh that originally doesn't fit the shape a bit. So that's why I like to use the move tool and just to try to fit the shape as much as I can. And I find that the projection works a lot better, right? So that looks really good. I'm really happy with that, right? So what I'm going to do is just fire up Substance Painter in the background here because I want to test out how the baking is going to work. Right, so whilst that starts up, I'm just going to export this out and the high poly as well. So let's highlight the low poly here, and I'm just going to save this just in case. Great, so with the subtool selected, which is this one here, I'm going to go all the way to the top tool palette and go to export. So we want to export that tool. I'm going to save that to my, those are the ones I did before. So my desktop, let's just do it here in the desktop. Delete those old ones. And this is our high poly. So I'm just going to rename this high poly. Sorry, this is my low poly. So LP. And the high poly, I'll do the same thing as well. Just highlight that subtool, export. And then I'm just going to make that nice and simple for me and just say HP for high poly. So let's jump over to Substance Painter. Right. What we want to do is start a new project. So let's go to File, New, and then we want to adjust the template here. Now the template's not overly important because we can change that during export time. But what I like to do, knowing that I'm going to be in Unreal, is just change the template to Unreal Engine 4. Unreal Engine 5 is the same thing, like the setup is the same, so it doesn't really matter. So Unreal Engine 4 is what we want to use. The file section here, we want to import the low poly mesh. Remember, this is just a test. So none of this is unwrapped properly. So we're going to use the auto unwrapper inside Substance. It's pretty decent, but it's not very good at the same time. So you might find that you have some errors, which might not be a bake issue, but an unwrap issue. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to increase the document size to 4K, just so we can see some details. We probably wouldn't use 4K for just one singular piece on the shoulder armor, but for now I'm going to keep that at 4K. And I'm going to have auto unwrap turned on just for this example. Right. Press OK. Some pop-ups might come up, and that's just unwrapping, and we get to see the results here. So that looks pretty good. Let's check out the unwraps. So 2D, that looks like an auto unwrap. And so we know we have an unwrap, so that's good. So let's start baking this thing now. So what I want to do is go to the menu bar at the top here and go to this icon, this croissant here. So let's open that and we go to the bake menu. So I'm just going to change the output size here under mesh maps to 4K, just the same as what we had when we made the template. And over here where it says high poly parameters, we want to use the high poly that we exported from ZBrush. So to do that, we need to press this little paper icon, and then we can import that high poly. So depending on how much detail you have or how many polygons that high poly is, that might take a bit of time, but here we have the high poly version. So it's come in fairly nicely and it's created this cage. Now what Substance is going to do is it's going to basically project out from the high poly surface. So you can see here, this is the high poly cage, or the low poly cage, sorry. And this sort of, this blue color is the high poly. So you can see this red part here, and that's basically the cage from the low poly that's not capturing the high poly sculpture that we imported. So all we need to do is adjust the frontal distance, which is this slider here. So let's just increase that until that's all captured. That looks good. Now what we don't want to do is just max this out, because it gets to the point where the cage intersects with itself, and that's a bad idea. So the better we can avoid these red little dots everywhere before we jump into Substance and use this slider, the better, right? A little bit of adjustment is fine. So let's just run with the default settings. And Substance is just going to bake through these individual maps on the left here, which are pretty crucial when it comes to taking full advantage of Substance Painter's texturing abilities. So let's return to paint mode and let's take a look. For any errors, so I've already spotted one, and it's this guy here. So we can see that there's a bake issue here where it looks like the mesh is too thin still. So it's just too thin, and what's happened is that the bake distance has come through to the other side, right? That's probably in one of these guys here, maybe the curvature, right? You can sort of see that, and the ambient occlusion, right? So we do want to fix it, right? So I'll probably take it back into ZBrush and just thicken that area out, and then redo this part. Or we can adjust the bake distances here, so the rear distance, and see if we can mess around with this slider to get a better result. So it looks like I would need to either mess around with this more or take it back into ZBrush. And for me, I think taking it back into ZBrush and just fixing that area would be a much quicker job. But let's just say that's all fixed. Besides that little piece here, everything looks really, really nice. So remember, this is a low poly mesh. Well, actually, this area could use a bit of work, although you don't really see that on the model. So it kind of gets hidden by some other pieces. So I'm not too concerned. But that looks really good. So this is a low poly mesh. So I'm just going to activate the wireframes so you can see. And it's a very low poly mesh, but it looks high poly because we baked all our sculpted details on. Like the slashes are coming through really nicely. And what's good about this is that these slashes and these little noises on the surface, they react to the materials that we put on and the smart mask and so on. So if I go to my smart materials just to test everything out to see if things are working as expected, I might just put a material on here and let's use like this this leather might be a good one just to see how it's working. And that is coming through, so we've got to fix that. But everything looks great, right? So this is a UV projection. The UVs aren't done properly, so that's why it looks all messed up. But we can try to fix it by changing that to triplanar. Remember, this is just an example, well, just to see how the baking and all that's working, and it looks great. I'm really happy with that. So I'm going to test that again with a smart material. I'm using the classic painted steel with chip edges, and you can see that the slashes are reacting to that that smart material and all the other details that I made as well. Let's try another one. You can see that the surface detail that I sculpted in, the smart material is reacting to that as well, which is awesome, right? So that saved me a lot of work by sculpting that in before jumping into Substance. And let's try another one. Let's try, what's this? A copper of some sorts, right? You can see that reaction happening to the corners and curves. Great, so that looks really good. I'm really happy with that. So I just got to fix one little part. So let's jump back to ZBrush here. And the goal for me is to do this process for each and every one of these little pieces that I have here. Right, so bring all these guys back. So each and every one of these pieces, I want to do this process for. Like I said, it's something that's debatable, right? It's not something that we would do for every single piece of geometry that we make. And depending on the poly budget of your model or of your game or whatever you're working on, you might have to use a singular mesh. But just to keep things simple for this first pass, I'm just going to do that exact process for each and every one of those pieces. Right? And then we'll combine them together into one subtool, and we'll do that later. And then we can unwrap it all at once. Right? That's how we prep our models for unwrapping and texturing.